I'm Josh Ryan, licensed professional counselor, and this is Pause and Respond, the framework for emotional control, disciplined thinking, and better decisions under pressure. Have you ever walked away from a conversation only to realize the conversation never walked away from you? Your body left the room, your words stopped, the other person even moved on with their day, but somewhere inside, the conversation kept going. One more response, one more explanation, one more point you wish you had made, one more chance to finally be understood. It's remarkable how often conversations end externally long before they end internally. Sometimes that's the conversation we carry the longest. Maybe it wasn't another conversation at all. Maybe it was the text you sent an hour later, the email you rewrote 3 times, the message you typed, deleted, and typed again. Now, because new information appeared, not because the conversation suddenly changed, but because something inside you couldn't let it end. Most people think the need for the last word is about winning. Sometimes that's true. But I don't think that's the deepest reason. For many people, the hardest part isn't disagreement. It's the possibility of being misunderstood. Because being misunderstood often feels strangely similar to being unseen. And when you've spent years building your identity around being understood, or even appreciated or seen as good, misunderstanding doesn't feel like a communication problem. It resonates like an identity problem. Now here's the sentence I hope you'll remember today. The need for the last word is often the need for one last chance to be understood. Let's read that again. The need for the last word is often the need for one last chance to be understood. Now, if this is true, then maybe the conversation that's going on inside isn't really about convincing another person. Maybe it's about calming something inside yourself that feels deeply unsettled. Think back over the last several episodes. In one episode, we replayed conversations. In the 6th episode, we discovered we were replaying the stories we'd attached to those conversations. And today we're going to ask a different question. Why does your nervous system refuse to let either one of those end? Because once you see that connection, you'll begin understanding something much deeper than conflict. You begin understanding yourself. I've watched this happen in counseling countless times. Someone spends 10 minutes explaining why they weren't trying to hurt another person. Finally, I'll ask one simple question. What would happen if they still misunderstood you? Almost every time the room becomes quiet. Not because they don't know the answer, but because they've just discovered the real question. Sometimes we're not fighting for the last word. We're fighting against the fear that someone might leave the conversation believing something about us that isn't true, or something that makes us feel uncomfortable. And when your identity depends on being seen as kind, being misunderstood doesn't feel inconvenient. It feels dangerous. When your identity depends on being seen as responsible, misunderstanding feels like you're losing parts of your character. And when your identity depends on being seen as good, the last word quietly becomes one last attempt to protect who you believe you are. And that's why some conversations become impossible to leave. Once again, identity has silently entered the room. This is where I want to introduce another idea we'll come back to throughout today's episode. The unfinished conversation. Some conversations end externally long before they end internally. The other person has already moved on, but your mind keeps running, replaying, rewriting, explaining. Not because you enjoy it, but because your nervous system is still trying to finish something it doesn't know how to release. That's the unfinished conversation. And many of us have been carrying one for years. Imagine someone disagrees with you. The conversation ends politely. No one raises their voice, no one storms out, nothing dramatic occurs during this conversation. But all evening, your mind keeps rehearsing new responses, stronger examples, better explanations, maybe even some more convincing arguments. Eventually, I think we have to ask a different question. And that's, who are we still talking to? Are we still really talking to that other person? Or are we talking to the part of ourselves that's afraid they no longer see correctly? And that's a completely different conversation. Notice how often your body wants an additional conversation, when what your heart actually needs is reassurance. Reassurance that you're still okay, that you're still worthy, that one disagreement didn't change who you are. Now, sometimes we keep talking because we're still waiting for someone else. And we're waiting for them to settle a question never answered inside ourselves. And that simple question, am I still enough? That's a question that no amount of explaining can ever answer. One of the most difficult truths I've learned over the years is this: external conversations can never permanently quiet internal uncertainty. You can get the apology. You may even win the argument. You can factually prove your point. You may even hear the words, "You're right," and still find yourself unsettled. Because the conversation you were really trying to finish was never happening between you and that other person. It was happening inside of you. Now, maybe peace doesn't come from finally getting the last word. Maybe peace begins the moment you no longer need another person to settle a question you've never answered inside yourself. Sit with that, because I think that's what today's episode is really about. Not arguments, communication, or even conflict itself. It's about learning how emotionally secure people let conversations end without needing another person's agreement, and to know that they're still okay. And that leads us to the question we'll spend the rest of today's episode exploring. What makes some conversations so difficult to leave? Because until we understand the fear underneath the last word, we'll keep trying to solve an internal need with external conversations. And that's a battle no one ever truly wins. Now, one of the questions I've found myself asking clients over the years is surprisingly simple. That question: what feels at risk if they misunderstand you? At first, most people answer the surface question. They may say, well, they'll think I'm wrong, or they'll think I was unfair, or maybe that they didn't care. But if you stay with that question just a little bit longer, something deeper almost always begins to emerge. And that sounds like they'll think I'm a bad husband, or they'll think I'm a bad mother. They'll think I don't love them. They'll think I'm selfish. Now, notice what happened. The conversation quietly moved from behavior to identity. And that's almost always where the real struggle lives. If you've ever found yourself unable to let a conversation end, I don't think it's because you're necessarily argumentative. I don't think it's because you may enjoy conflict. And I don't even think it's because you're trying to be right most times. I think your nervous system is asking a much older question. Am I still safe if someone sees me differently than I see myself? Now, that's a completely different conversation because now we're no longer talking about opinions. We're talking about belonging. I've come to believe something for years of counseling people through conflict. For many of us, being understood quietly stopped feeling like a preference, and it became emotional safety. And if being misunderstood regularly led to criticism, conflict, rejection, or emotional distance, your nervous system learned something. It learned that clarity wasn't simply helpful, it was protective. So years later, when someone misunderstands your intentions, your body doesn't respond as though a conversation became difficult. It responds as though the relationship itself may no longer be safe. Children don't simply need food and shelter. They need to feel known. They need to believe someone sees them accurately. When that experience is repeated consistently, children slowly develop something remarkable. They learn that they remain lovable even when they're misunderstood. But when that experience becomes inconsistent, many children begin performing clarity. They become explainers, overfunctioneers, peacekeepers. Not because they necessarily enjoy it, but because misunderstanding became emotionally expensive to them. Now, I've worked with people who've spent years trying to become impossible to misunderstand. They over-explain, they over-apologize, they rewrite text messages, clarify every detail. And that's not because they're obsessive. It's because somewhere deep inside, they're still trying to earn something they never consistently experienced. And that's the feeling of being fully known, without having to prove themselves first. And here's something that changed the way I understand conflict. Sometimes the person you're trying the hardest to convince isn't sitting across from you. It's the younger version of yourself that still believes misunderstanding leads to rejection. And that's why today's conversations feel much bigger than they actually are. They aren't just happening in the present. They're echoing older experiences your nervous system still remembers. I've watched couples spend 30 minutes arguing over something that lasted 30 seconds. Not because the issue mattered, but because each person desperately wanted the other to understand what was happening inside of them. Now, eventually, I'll stop the conversation and ask both of them, if each of you never completely understand each other's intentions, what does that mean about you? This is where it gets quiet, because that's the real question. Not who's right, but am I still okay if someone gets me wrong? One of the invisible contracts many of us carry around sounds something like this. If I explain myself well enough, if I choose the perfect words, if they finally understand my heart, then I'll finally be at peace. Now, no one else signed that contract, but you've spent years trying to honor it. And the problem is, peace built on someone else's perfect understanding will always feel fragile, because people misunderstand each other all the time. It's part of being human. One of the most freeing truths I've ever discovered is this: people can misunderstand you and still love you. People can disagree with you and still respect you. People can fail to see your heart without changing your worth. Because if you truly believe that, you no longer have to chase the last word. Here's another sentence I hope you'll remember. Being misunderstood is healing. Making your peace dependent on being understood is exhausting. One invites connection, the other creates pressure. Pressure on every conversation, on every disagreement, within every relationship. Because now every misunderstanding feels like something that must be repaired before you can finally breathe again. And that most emotionally secure people I've met still explain themselves. They still seek understanding. They still apologize when they're wrong. But they no longer make another person's interpretation responsible for their identity, and that's the difference. They know who they are before the conversation begins, which means they don't need the conversation to decide it for them. Maybe that's the invitation today. Not to stop wanting to be understood. I mean, that's a pretty deep human desire. Maybe the invitation is to stop believing that your worth rises and falls with someone else's ability to understand you. Because once your identity becomes stronger than misunderstanding, you no longer need the last word. Not because you don't care, but because you finally stopped asking another person to settle a question you've learned to answer inside yourself. So how do emotionally secure people actually leave conversations well? How do they resist the urge to send one more text, or make one more point, or chase one more explanation? Now, the answer isn't found in better communication techniques. It's found in something much deeper. And that's learning to trust your identity, even when the conversation ends without complete understanding. Imagine standing at the front door after an argument. Your hand is on the doorknob. The conversation is over. You could just leave, and you probably should leave. But something inside you won't let you. So you turn back around and start one more thing. Have you ever noticed that? That almost irresistible pull to just say one more sentence, one more explanation or clarification. Most people think that's about the conversation. I don't. I think it's about something much older. The people who can leave conversations well aren't people who care less. They're people who trust themselves more, and that's the difference. They still value understanding. They still care deeply. They still hope relationships will continue to grow stronger. But they no longer believe every difficult conversation has to end perfectly before they can have peace. They've learned to trust something many of us are still learning to build, and that's themselves. By now, we've talked about unfinished conversations, the need to be understood, the fear of being misunderstood. Now we're arriving at the deeper question. And that's, can I trust who I've become, even if this conversation never fully resolves? That's a very different question than, how do I make them understand me? One is about communication, the other is about identity. And most of us think we're looking for one more sentence, but often we're looking for one more feeling, understanding, approval, permission, reassurance, or validation. If I send one more text, what am I hoping they'll finally give me? If I explain one more time, what am I hoping will finally settle inside me? Those are much better questions, because once you discover what you're actually looking for, the conversation can begin to change. I've watched couples stay in arguments for another hour, long after the original issue disappeared. Eventually, they're no longer discussing what took place. They're answering a much quieter question. Do you still see me the way I hope you do? Nobody says those words, but both people are answering them. One keeps explaining while the other defends. Neither one is really fighting about the dishes or the money or the schedule. They're fighting for reassurance and for connection. They're fighting for the belief that one difficult moment hasn't changed who they are in the eyes of the person they love. And that's why the last word rarely creates the peace we're hoping for. Because we're asking another person to answer a question that belongs inside of us. Am I still enough? No explanation can permanently answer that. No perfectly crafted text can settle that forever. No argument won can finally satisfy that question. Because identity can never be permanently established by someone else's response. Resolution depends on two people. Peace often begins with one. Think about that. There are conversations you'll never completely resolve. People who may never feel fully understood your intentions. Relationships where you'll never receive the apology you hoped for. And if your peace depends on complete resolution, your peace will always depend on another person's participation. And that is a very fragile way to live. This is where I think we discover something I've come to call internal closure. External conversations end. Internal closure begins the moment you stop asking another person to settle your identity. That doesn't mean you stop caring, and it doesn't mean you stop repairing. It simply means your worth no longer waits for someone else's conclusion. And that's emotional freedom. The stronger your sense of worth becomes, the less urgency you need another person's agreement. Not because agreement stops mattering, but because your identity no longer depends on it. You can disagree without disappearing. You can be misunderstood without becoming undone. You can leave a conversation without leaving your peace behind. And that's emotional maturity. Imagine how much emotional energy you've spent over the years trying to create external closure, when what your heart was really longing for was internal peace. Think about the replaying, the rewriting, the rehearsing, the explaining, the sleepless nights. Not because you loved too much, but because you were asking conversations to do something they were never designed to do. One of the most courageous things emotionally secure people learn is how to trust silence. Silence isn't always distance, doesn't always mean rejection. Silence isn't always the beginning of the end. Sometimes silence is simply where trust begins. Trust that you've spoken honestly. Trust that you've listened well. Trust that you've done what belongs to you. Trust that another person's response no longer has to determine whether you're okay. Now here's a sentence I hope you'll remember. The conversation ends the moment you stop asking another person to decide who you are. I'll read that again, right? The conversation ends the moment you stop asking another person to decide who you are. Because I think that's one of the deepest truths we've uncovered this season. Sometimes the bravest sentence in a relationship isn't, "Let me explain one more thing." Sometimes it's I've said what I needed to say. I've listened as well as I know how, and I trust that's enough. That's not giving up, that's growing up. The people who experience the most peace after difficult conversations aren't the people who always get the last word. They're the people who've learned to trust the person they've become more than they trust the fear that another conversation will finally make everything okay. And that's freedom. Not because every conversation ends perfectly, but because you no longer need perfection to live with peace. So, what does it actually look like tomorrow morning? How do you know the difference between a conversation that truly needs another discussion and a nervous system that's simply asking for reassurance? Because I want to finish today's episode with one simple practice, one question, one habit that has helped me personally transform clients over the years and change the way I leave difficult conversations. Not by teaching people how to win them, but by helping them trust themselves after those conversations are over. Imagine what your relationships would feel like if every disagreement no longer threatened your identity. Imagine walking away from difficult conversations without replaying them until 2 o'clock in the morning. Imagine trusting yourself enough that another person's silence no longer felt like an emergency. Imagine no longer believing every misunderstanding had to be repaired before you were allowed to have peace. That's emotional freedom. Not because life becomes easier, but because you've become steadier. And that's where we've been heading all season. Over the last 4 episodes, we quietly uncovered something together. First, we discovered how to protect our identity. Then, we questioned the stories our minds create. We explored how many of us learn to measure our worth by being needed. And today, we arrive at the final step, learning to trust the person you've become. Because emotional maturity isn't just learning to regulate your emotions, it's learning to remain connected to yourself even when a conversation doesn't go the way you'd hope. Now, I want to leave you with one practice, not because it's clever, but because I genuinely believe it has power to change the very next difficult conversation you have. The next time a conversation ends, before you reach for your phone, before you write another text, before you rehearse one more explanation, pause and ask yourself 2 questions. 1, have I spoken honestly? Now, if the answer is no, go back, repair, apologize, and clarify. Do what belongs to you. But if the answer is yes, you ask the second question. Am I looking for understanding or reassurance? Now, don't rush past that, because those 2 needs, they feel similar, but they lead 2 very different lives. I've never met a client who regretted speaking honestly, but I've met many who regretted speaking fearfully. Fear keeps talking, explaining, and defending. Fear keeps reaching for one more sentence, not because fear is trying to ruin the relationship, but because fear is trying to protect the person carrying it. And that's an important distinction. If you discover you're looking for reassurance, don't criticize yourself. Don't shame yourself. Just smile for a moment. Your nervous system is simply trying to protect someone who truly needed that protection a long time ago. And quietly remind yourself, we're safe now. That one sentence has incredible power, because healing isn't arguing with your nervous system. Healing is gently teaching it that it no longer has to live in yesterday's world. Healthy people don't trust themselves because they never make mistakes. They trust themselves because they know a mistake no longer changes who they fundamentally are. Because that may be one of the most important things we've talked about all season. Your worth is no longer on trial every time someone misunderstands you. Your identity is no longer waiting for another person's verdict. That's emotional safety. Something else begins to change too. You realize you're no longer carrying borrowed conversations. Just like you've stopped carrying borrowed emotions. Now think about that. How many conversations have you carried for days that the other person stopped thinking about before dinner? How many sleepless nights were spent trying to rewrite something that was already over? You can stop carrying borrowed conversations. You begin getting your life back. I also think there's something deeply healing about gratitude. Gratitude for the version of yourself that believed every conversation had to end perfectly. That version wasn't weak, it wasn't foolish, it wasn't even broken. It was simply just trying to protect you. It didn't know there was another way. Honor that version of yourself, thank it, then gently tell it, you don't have to work so hard anymore. And one of the deepest questions I've learned to ask myself is this: if no one ever completely understands this conversation, will I still believe I'm okay? That's not really a communication question. It's an identity one. Because emotionally secure people eventually discover something life changes. Another person's misunderstanding does not have the authority to redefine who you are. So think past over the last few episodes. We replayed conversations, we repaired after reactions, we slowed emotional speed, we discovered defensiveness, we questioned our interpretations. We even put down borrowed weight. And today, we're learning to leave conversations without leaving ourselves. At first, those sounded like difficult struggles, but underneath, they've all been asking the same question: who am I becoming? Who am I becoming not when life is easy, but when relationships become difficult? Because that's where identity is revealed. The healthiest conversations aren't the ones where everyone agrees. They're the ones where no one has to abandon themselves in order to stay connected to the relationships. Think about that. How many years have you spent believing those were the same thing? That keeping the relationships required losing ourselves? Well, it doesn't. Healthy love asks something much different. It asks for honesty, humility, curiosity, and courage. Not self-abandonment. Never self-abandonment. One day you're going to walk away from a difficult conversation. Not because everything was resolved, not because every misunderstanding disappeared, but because you'll realize something that changes the way you live. Peace doesn't begin when another person finally understands you. Peace begins when you stop abandoning yourself while trying to be understood. So this week, practice one sentence. Whenever you feel yourself reaching for one more explanation, one more text, one more attempt to finally settle the conversation, pause, take a breath, and simply ask, have I already done what belongs to me? If the answer is yes, let the conversation rest. Trust the relationship, trust the process, and most importantly, trust the person you've become. Now, if today's episode resonated with you, I encourage you to go back and listen to episodes 5 through 8 as one connected journey. Together, they explore how we protect our identity, interpret our experiences, and measure our worth, and ultimately learn to trust ourselves. I believe they form one of the most important conversations we've had on Pause and Respond. And if you're ready to begin practicing these ideas in your everyday life, please visit pauseandrespond.com. Pick up the book, the workbooks, read the blog. They're all designed to help you build these habits one conversation at a time until they become part of who you naturally are. And if someone came to mind while you were listening today, make sure you share this episode with them. Not because they need another communication strategy, but because they may need permission to finally stop carrying conversations that ended a long time ago. This is Pause and Respond. We're not trying to get the last word. We're becoming the kind of people who no longer need it. Because the strongest relationships aren't built by people who always finish every conversation. They're built by people who never have to leave themselves to stay connected to someone else. Till next time, less reaction, more choice.